Many of the upgrades I've been doing to my Winnebago Revel over the last couple of years are really a result of me living in the van, using the van, and then seeing the need of an upgrade. The one upgrade I'm doing today is very different though. Up to 2 weeks ago, I didn't even know I needed it. I didn't even know it was possible to do it. But then I was browsing through the Winnebago Revel forum, link down in the video description, and I came across a thread talking about a disconnect switch for the second alternator. And not only did we discuss the benefits of having such a disconnect switch, we also talked about how to implement one. As it turns out, it is very, very easy. So thank you Winnebago Revel forum for not only the inspiration for today's upgrade, but also for all the technical details on how to putting it in. And you might be wondering, why would I even need a disconnect switch for the auxiliary alternator? And that's a good question. We'll talk about the benefits and why you want one in a little while. But first, let's talk about how to install it. My Revel is a 2022 model and it has these two lithium batteries here in the garage area. And whenever the engine is running, the second alternator tries to charge them up to 100%. But because lithium batteries cannot be charged when they are too cold, when they are below, I think around 32 degrees Fahrenheit, Winnebago installed a thermal switch. This one right here. So when the temperatures in the van drop below a certain threshold, this switch opens and that stops the alternator from outputting any power into the batteries. So let's draw this out. We have this little temperature switch. And basically this goes to some electronics that regulate the second alternator. When the thermal switch is in an on position, so when it is closed, then the alternator is engaged. When the thermal switch is in an off position, when it's open, then the second alternator is disengaged, it is disabled. So really the most simple way to put in a manual disconnect switch is, well, putting a manual disconnect switch into the circuit. So in addition to the thermal switch breaking the circuit, this additional switch could break it as well. And when this one is turned off, then it doesn't really matter what the thermal switch does. This circuit would be interrupted and the second alternator would not be working. Of course, it would be a little inconvenient to have such a switch down there in the garage area. I want one in the cockpit area that I can operate while I'm driving the van. So I picked up this one here. This is an OEM Mercedes switch that goes into the dash. Now I could simply break the circuit here, run two long wires up to the cockpit area and put in this switch. This would for sure do the trick. But that's not how I'm going to install it. Instead, I will be putting in a relay for this switch. And then I still run my two wires, but these ones are the ones controlling the relay, and I will connect them to the switch. So the switch in the cab area will not directly disconnect the circuit. This switch will trigger a relay, and the relay will disconnect the circuit. Well, actually, I will be putting in the relay in a normally closed position. That means when the relay is not engaged, the circuit will be closed. So when the switch up in the cab area is in the off position, then the relay is not engaged, the circuit is closed, and the alternator will be engaged, obviously when the engine is running. And then if I want to disengage the second alternator, I can press the button on the switch, turn the switch on, which will in turn engage the relay. The relay will break the circuit, which will disengage the second alternator. And yes, this might be a little counterintuitive that I need to turn the dash switch on in order to turn the second alternator off. But I'm thinking I will be mostly driving with the second alternator on, and if I do, then the relay does not need to be engaged and the switch in the cab area will not be lit. So everything will look completely normal when the van is operating in kind of factory mode with the second alternator turned on. Hope that makes sense. Okay, with all the theoretical stuff out of the way, let's get started with the real work. I removed the panel that sits under the dash with the existing switches. So this is the one for the 4x4 and this is the one for low range. And I'm going to put the new switch in here, in this position right here. So I can just unclip the blank. Oops. Come on. I can just unclip the blank and then push the new switch in. Step one of many completed. Of course, I need to connect a bunch of wires to the switch. So I need plus 12 volts feeding into the switch, and I'm going to get that from the panel down here. This is one of the main fuse panels. And I have already tapped into this for my additional horn, so I know that this gray connector has only power with the engine running. So I'm going to put in an additional fuse and get 12 volts for my relay from this gray connector. And then I also need a power source, or the source that triggers the backlight of the switch when the lights are on. And I'm just stealing that from one of the other switches. So I just need to figure out which of these wires into the existing switches is the one that triggers the backlight. I'm just splicing it into this one. And then I need ground for that backlight. And again, I'm stealing that from one of the others. And then I need to run the cable, well, back to the relay, and that is probably the most difficult part of this whole operation, because I need to run the cable from up here in front all the way to the back. Let's start with the backlight illumination, and I'm pretty sure it is the cable that goes to pin number 1. It is this purple cable. This one exists in both switches, so in this one and in this one. And also the new one has the backlight illumination on pin 1. So I'm going to tap into this one, into this purple one, and kind of bridge it into my new switch. And I don't want to cut this existing purple wire and solder it back together with the other one attached. I just want to remove the insulation layer a little bit and then solder the other one in. So I want to be very careful here. Just score it and then peel away the insulation. Here's my new cable with the right connector at one end. So this will clip into the housing of the new switch. And I'm going to loop this around this one here now. And I can solder it in. So now I'll run the 12 volts from the main fuse panel over to the new switch. So these are the connectors that go into this fuse panel. I picked them up on Amazon a while ago, and I'll put a link to the article down into the video description. I think they are out of stock right now, but perhaps the part numbers in that description will help you find an alternative. If I remove this one bolt here at the bottom of the fuse holder, I can tilt this whole thing up ever so slightly to give me enough room to wiggle in this new cable down from the bottom. This one. I have to snake it now from this side here over to the other side to where my switch is. And because I have not installed a fuse yet, obviously there's no power on the cable, so this is completely safe. Well, here we are. Cable successfully routed to the other side. The next connection I need to make is the ground connection. And for that I want to tap into an existing ground point of the van, which is up here. This is, I guess, very hard to see, but there's a nut with a few brown cables behind it, and that's where I'm going to attach an additional brown one for my ground connection. Well, as it turns out, my brown cable is black, but it will serve the same purpose. It looks a bit messy now. This is my ground cable, and obviously I need to connect that up into the switch, which will be in this area, but then I also need to run ground to the relay all the way in the back. So I'm leaving it here for now, and then I will run the cable all the way back to the relay, and then kind of make a connection point between this one and the one that feeds into the switch and the one that feeds into the relay. So here's my hopefully way too long cable that I now need to run from down here, from the garage area, all the way up to the front to where the switch is. And I'm going to install the relay, I think here, on the side of this box thing there. This panel under the shower pan just snaps off, and that pretty much opens a nice wide area for the cable to be run all the way to under the bench seat. And we arrived under the bench seat. The most challenging part now is to get the cable from under the bench seat up to where the switch is in front, and I think the only way I could think of is to go through this hatch here. So if I drill a hole into the side wall on this side, I can bring the cable into this area, and then I can drill another hole into this blocking over here and get the cable into the cavity over here, and then somehow bring it further up front. It is not super ideal, but it is acceptable to me anyway. And out on this side. And from here I think I just go under the floor trim, around the driver's seat, again under the floor trim up to, well, the dashboard area. This is not a high traffic area and the cable is protected, and there's obviously the floor trim above the cable and then this weather mat thing above the floor trim, so I think that should be alright. My cable is coming out here now. I can go inside of the battery box and then come out on the other side alongside these cables, and then I'm right up here in the right area. Here's where the cable enters the battery box, and it can still wiggle a little bit, so it's not pinched in, which is a good thing. So here's my third connection into the new switch, and this is only ground, so this is only for the, I guess, the backlight of the switch and the control LED that turns on when the switch is on. So I need to tie that into the ground cable that I installed previously. Down here I'm making a three-way connection now. Ground coming from the van, from the ground point on the sidewall, going to ground of the relay, which is this one, and then I'm also tying into ground for the switch, so the backlight of the switch is going to work. So I just need to connect those three cables here. And then my last connection into the switch is this red one, and this is what will be sending 12 volts to the relay when the switch is on. Now I can insert all my switch wires here into the housing of the switch. Now of course have to insert it into the right position. So number one down here is for the backlight. Then the one above is the 12-volt power input, and this is the one that is coming from the fuse panel. Then the next one will be left empty. Then the next one above that is the load, so this is what's going to the relay. And then finally ground is up here, so that one gets inserted into this one. Click, and that's it. Well, and with that I can put this dash trim piece thing back in. Of course I need to connect the switches. And back in the garage area. So like I said, I want to put the relay in here to the side of the box, and to mount it I'm going to install a riv nut. So I need to drill a hole. To use the relay in a normally closed position, I need one pin on number 30, which is this one, the bottom one here, and then one on 87A, which is the first horizontal one here. If I wanted to use it in a normally open position, I would go between the bottom one and the top one, and then when the relay switches, it would be closed. If I'm using the middle one, then when the relay turns on, this is open. Great. I dropped the Allen key and it fell in right here in between this trim piece and the shelf, somewhere down here now. And now might be a good time to test this whole thing. So these two red wires, these are the ones that I'm going to loop into the circuit for the temperature switch. And with the relay off, not engaged, I should have continuity, and I do. And with the switch up front turned on, I should no longer have continuity, which means the circuit with this temperature switch is open, which means the AUX alternator does not get engaged. Let's test that one out. First I have to put a fuse in here, and this is just for the relay really, and it uses about like 1/10 of an amp. So I'm putting in a 1 amp fuse. This should be plenty enough. The fuse holder I was using is only providing power when the engine is running, or well, when the ignition is on. So let's turn it on and push the button. Alright, the light is on, which is a good sign, and now we have to check in the back if we no longer have continuity. And nothing. And really the final step is now to loop the relay into the existing wiring of the thermo switch. And for that I can just remove either of the cables, doesn't really matter which one. And then I'm plugging one side into the cable I just removed, and the other side goes back on the actual switch. And I can not do that with just a single hand, so I need to put the camera down and do it. And that's it. One side of the switch now has the red wire attached that goes to the relay. Then it comes back out of the relay, which is this one here, and connects to the yellow cable that used to connect to the switch. So really the relay is now looped in with the yellow wires. So let's talk about the why of this whole upgrade. Generally speaking, having the second alternator keeping the batteries topped off as much as possible is a good thing. But there's a few situations where you would drive the van only for a few minutes. For example, between the gas station and the supermarket parking lot, or for me when I'm parked inside of my carport here and I pull the van up to my house. It only takes a couple of minutes, and I don't think it is very good for the batteries if they start charging and then immediately, like after a minute or so, stop being charged. So in those situations when I know I will only be going for like 3 minutes, I can just disable the secondary alternator and don't even start the charging cycle. Also, running the secondary alternator to charge the batteries obviously puts a little more stress on the engine of the Sprinter. So, in some situations, for example, pulling out of the camp spot in the morning, wet grass, maybe slightly uphill, then turning off the secondary alternator gives the van a little more power to move itself. And then the last reason for me is when I'm just using the van on a day trip, I don't really want the batteries to be charged to all the way up to 100% if then the rest of the week the van just sits in the garage. So in this case, I can have the alternator stop charging the batteries and I can run them down to about whatever 80–75%, which is for long-term storage way better for lithium-ion batteries than having them charged to 100%. So having this alternator disconnect switch just gives me a little bit more control over when to charge the batteries. Simple as that. And you might be wondering why I picked a switch that has this light symbol. Well, two reasons. Well, really only one reason. I had the switch on hand. But the other reason is kind of that in German, the word for alternator is Lichtmaschine, which translates into light machine. So the machine producing light. So having a light symbol on that switch that regulates the light machine, the Lichtmaschine, I think is very fitting. Anyway, that's all I had for today. Thank you for watching and I hope to see you soon. Bye bye.